AGI. Appreciate you being with us.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Mark, for having me here today and inviting this panel. I hope this answers some questions from a breed association and consumer perspective. We have a large panel up here today. I think we're waiting on one more panelist, Mr. Tom Brink, if you're in the house. If we can make your way to the stage, we'd sure appreciate that. But we won't wait to start on introductions. From that standpoint, Mark's looking around. I'm sure that he'll herd the cats back into the arena. So, like I said, a great panel we have here today. Allison Rivera comes from us, from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. She's the Executive Director of Government Affairs, and so probably has a little bit of different viewpoint from coming from the Washington, D.C. Type of populous area and kind of what gene editing and some of those conversations that will take place. It'll be interesting to hear her perspective. Kara Gherkin is on the panel this morning. She comes from us from Where Food Comes From. She's the Senior Program Analyst there at Where Food Comes From. She was formerly with the Livestock and Meat Marketing Specialist with USDA. So she's going to bring us some consumer data that I think will be really interesting for us to kind of dive into and divulge. With that, we have Banks Baker with us. He works with the Pig Improvement Company, or PIC, so a sister company to basically ABS here for those of us in the beef industry. He's the Global Director of Product Sustainability, and PIC has really been kind of on the forefront of this gene editing technology with their PRRS-resistant pig, and I hope that we can learn a lot from Banks as we go throughout the day. And then the other three gentlemen, we won't spend a lot of time, Mark and Jack, introducing you two, right? Because I think you've been around, right? And we've had you in these types of environments before. But obviously, Mark McCulley, who is the CEO of the American Angus Association, previously spent 27 years at Certified Angus Beef. And with that, we have Mr. Jack Ward from the American Hereford Association, who has obviously been there for a long tenure as well. Tom Brink, that I think will be joining us here in a minute. He's with the Red Angus Association of America, and we'll add him in as he comes. But maybe to get started, we had a few introductions. So we'll start with Allison, the other Allison, as we were talking about before. So two Allisons that are very well educated with us here today. But we'll start with Allison, let her give her introduction, and then we'll go to Kara and Banks. So, Allison, you're up.
Yes, I was saying the lesser of the two Allisons in the room today. So thank you for having me. NCBA is always happy to represent cattle producers and come to events like this. And I think today I am going to stick to being pretty high level. I think hopefully you guys will have some good questions. I know there was a great question earlier about kind of the politics involved and some of the consumer aspects, and maybe you'll hear some difference of opinions. I guess we'll see. But I definitely want to be able to answer any of those kind of political questions. I am not a scientist. I'm a political scientist, so it's very, very different. So please bear with me, but I want to give you just kind of a sense of where NCBA is on this issue. Slide, thanks. So obviously we're always looking, at NCBA, we're always looking for ways to protect and make producers more profitable. That is our goal. It's one of our policy, our priorities for the year, to continue to make producers profitable, push back on regulations out of the federal government that make your lives harder, that make your jobs harder, and just get government out of the way when we need to. So obviously when we're talking about the impetus for genetic engineering, this is a tool in the toolbox that we want, that we have been able to move forward in the technology to make things move a little bit faster, and we want it to be a tool that's available to producers. And so we want to make sure that the regulatory space is in a place where that is possible. Slide. So obviously, genetic engineering is a more rapid and surefire way of producing the traits that we're looking for. Cattle producers are constantly being asked to do more with less. You know, that word sustainability continues to pop up, and something that our team in DC and on the checkoff side has been very involved in with the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. But But again, as we continue to be asked to do more with less, we also have to feed more people, right? And not only are you being asked to feed the US population, but we're being asked to do more and feed the world. So in order to be able to do that, we have to be able to have all the tools necessary to be as efficient as possible. So I was talking earlier with some of my fellow panelists. You know, I think we're still, as a trade association, all of our policy comes from you all, comes from our members. And then that is the policy that myself and my team and others in DC take and move forward on. We're always keeping an eye in this space, working with FDA, working with USDA. But at the end of the day, I can only do so much as what our policy book says. And currently, our policy book is very specific, and this was mentioned earlier. Our policy position is that regulation of livestock gene editing should reside with USDA. We feel like they are the better regulatory agency to manage this tool in the toolbox. That's true in a lot of places that we see things. I always like to use the example, which is outside of the topic today, but even programs like ag labor. It sits over at Department of Labor, but USDA understands the needs of ag labor much better, and we are always pushing for programs like the H-2A program to be moved over to USDA instead of DOL. So this is another example of where we think that USDA, given, you know, they might need some more resources, but given the right resources, which we feel like they do already have a lot of those resources, and we would obviously work with Congress to provide them any more that they needed, but we do believe that the best agency to be handling this tool is USDA. Genetic engineering, so I know that a lot of this has already been spoken about, and we believe that genetic engineering is not an animal drug, and therefore would like to have it moved over to USDA. Slide. So this is just our policy, as you can see in the books. It's very, very specific. One, therefore, be it resolved. Slide. And again, I think some of this has already been discussed today, the new guidance that came out. At the end of the Trump administration, we did see a memorandum of understanding signed between USDA and FDA. Again, to Dr. Van Enneman's points, it was kind of towards the end, last-minute type of situation, but that was moving us in the right direction. Within the last couple of weeks, on May 3rd, we did see that recent announcement to have USDA at the table. I think we are still figuring out within our office what kind of comments we might make as we move forward with this recent MOU and some of the guidance that's come out. But again, we're going to take the policy that we have on our books to form those comments. Slide. So again, I think you're going to hear maybe a little bit more on the research side, the consumer side. We don't do a lot of consumer research in our government affairs office at NCBA, but the Beef Checkoff obviously does a lot of consumer research. But I will say, just from a personal perspective of living in Washington, D.C., the Northern Virginia area, living and working with a lot of policymakers, a lot of what we have to continue to do in this space is educate consumers. My team spends a lot of time educating Hill staff, members of Congress, and I think while that is extremely important as we kind of move down this path, because as was alluded to earlier, if this conversation becomes more political or leaves the regulatory space and enters more of the political space, those members of Congress need to know the science, they need to know the facts, and they need to understand it so that we can work with them through the process. But again, that consumer piece is so important as well. I was just, mentioning to others in the room that I'm a mom of young children, and so I talk to a lot of other young moms. And if we think that consumers, they're still talking about GMOs, right? Dr. Van Enneman's talked about this a lot in the last 2 days. They still have a lot of concerns. If you are a mom in this room and you read any of the Instagram blogs and stuff, it is constant. It is constant. I spend probably multiple days a week at my daughter's t-ball game talking to other moms, and the stuff I hear, it's very interesting. And I spend a lot of time as someone who works in the beef industry, works for NCBA, kind of pushing back on a lot of the misinformation out there. So a lot of that impetus is on you all, is on organizations like NCBA, a lot of us in DC. We have to continue to push back on a lot of the misinformation out there so that as we see more technologies moving forward, people do not get uncomfortable or scared, but they understand that the product is safe, and that we should be able to continue to push forward with a lot of these technologies. And so that's going to take some work. That's something that we will continue to work on as well. But I know there's maybe some comments that were made about the consumer-facing piece, but I do think that that is a huge challenge. We saw that with mRNA vaccines conversation when we saw a bill in the Missouri House. NCBA's office got quite a few calls on that. We got quite a few colorful calls on that. And a lot of it was just complete misinformation about mRNA vaccines, how they're used, who's using them. And so making sure we then responded with, I think there was already a webinar in the works to talk through some of the vaccine usage and things like that. And again, that kind of stuff is run out of the checkoff, but very, very important. The one item go back, I'm sorry about that. A 2019-2020 Pew Research Center National Science Survey reported 27% of Americans thought GMOs were generally safe to eat, and 38% responded that they were unsafe to eat, and 33% said they didn't know enough. So that, I think, speaks to the point I just made. Next slide. So again, we're continuing to see global demand increase. I am not the trade expert in our office. Obviously, Dr. Van Enneman's done a good job of showing you kind of what other countries are doing, what we're not able to do. But at the end of the day, we know that all of our trading partners are somewhat fickle. And we know that trade is a fickle space, and that there are definitely politics involved. But also, we need to make sure that we have the tools to continue to be the best and continue to be able to produce the best beef in the world. And so we don't want to lag behind due to regulations that just simply don't work for our industry. Okay, next slide. I think that's it. Next slide. Okay, I think that's it for me, and then we're going to move to the next person.
Well, thank you, Allison, for that high-level overview. We're going to invite Ms. Kara up here, and she's going to give us some consumer data perspective.
Good morning. I am here to visit with you today as a member of Where Food Comes From, and the primary reason is because the space that we operate in is to help in the verification and validation of marketing claims that consumers are concerned with. So I'll tell you just a little bit about what Where Food Comes From is and where we originate from. Is that the right signal? There we go. We've got many divisions within Where Food Comes From. One that's most popular within the beef industry is IMI Global, and we've done a lot of verification on source and age verification, non-hormone-treated cattle, verified natural beef, some brazen beef. I understand that we made the news, maybe not in the best way today, but being questioned by consumer groups wanting to know what is the industry doing as a livestock industry, and are we trying to, I believe what Dr. Roundtree brought to our terminology yesterday was greenwashing, and exactly what kind of story are we trying to tell in agriculture. And Allison, to your point where you talk about where do we stand and how do we help educate consumers, we can work our very level best to educate consumers, but we will be negated harshly and quickly by different interest groups. And so we have to be very cautious and know going forward, particularly as we're dealing with gene editing, what is the consumer facing front on that? What does the consumer care about? so that as our technologies expand, that we can make sure that those technologies help meet the concerns that consumers have. So within IMI Global, then we also have an organics division. Validus does a lot of verification in the dairy and egg and poultry industries. Sure Harvest is our group that's out in California. They do a lot of tree nuts, cut flowers, the wine industry. And then our Patesla division is our newest division, and they're doing fish. Next slide, thank you. We've got over 26 years just in business of services offered in verification and validation. When we start adding in the number of years of experience of team members that we have that have been in this industry, I'm guessing that we're probably pushing upwards of 200 years of experience, just because of the team members that we bring in that, one, have agriculture backgrounds and that also are familiar with verification and validation. And those are a couple words that just let me pause for a quick minute and provide some insight. If I want to tell you that I want to sell you pink cows with purple polka dots, how do you know that that cow is pink with purple polka dots unless somebody validates it for you? As consumers become more removed from agriculture and have no idea why a pink with purple becomes very important to them, but if it's on a blog post or if it's on Instagram or if it's on social media somewhere, that's what they need to eat as the next designer type beef, that's what they're going to be looking for. And the only way that we can deliver that message is through some validation and verification, because no longer do we have the ability to walk to a fence line and shake someone's hand and say, that's what I promise I'm going to deliver you. We've got to be able to deliver it into a market space with verification and validation. Next slide. Our roots started in the beef industry. We started with verification. John Saunders started by developing a computer system that helped farmland industries many, many years ago. And then we hit the cow that stole Christmas in 2003. And from there, as an industry, we quickly learned how essential our export markets were to the beef industry. And from there, we also started learning what consumers, those foreign countries, were requiring of us to validate and deliver into that marketplace less than 20-month of age cattle. And thus, the impetus and the growth of Where Food Comes From and IMI Global, where we started. This just gives you a little bit of our quick background and how things grew, how we helped in verification of export verified through USDA so that we could regain that export market. And then it started to grow and expand into more verification within domestic marketing and marketing of domestic claims. Next, please. So when consumers are at the retail case, they're trying to make some decisions. And one of the things that we had come about was in late 2019 was the development of our CARE program. And the CARE program is a sustainable beef marketing program for the industry. And I'll show you in a little bit why it really matters to us as producers, because it has an impact on our pocketbook. And usually that's the first question that's asked by many producers is, how does it make a difference to me? There's a couple things that we're learning here as we learn about gene editing, is that there's a lot of things that are important to us about the technologies that are available that allow us to make some more rapid advancements in our production versus us having to wait for the interval and the breeding cycle for us to be able to make that change genetically just by breeding alone. So when consumers are out there, not only are we having to figure out what makes a difference for us genetically, but now we've got this technology and we've got to figure out how do we put that in a consumer front face so that that consumer can then have something that makes a difference to them. Consumers want to make a decision on, they want to do something that's better for them. They want to do something that's better for the animal, 37% of the time, 35% of the time better for the planet, and better for the farmer/worker. These are information and data that's brought to us from Miden Marketing in a report that they issued in 2023. With us from Miden today is Justana Schilling, and Justana will help me on the consumer-facing questions as they come around if I step out of line. So, but that's what we're looking at as we go into a marketplace. Consumers are trying to make some decisions. Someone made the point earlier, it really doesn't matter if we're not in a position where the price and the quality are on the table. You know, if you're in a situation to where you're not hungry and you're not scrapping for money, you get to make some decisions that we can look at in marketing claims, right? And so some of those come to play. But if you're in a position, and I think we had it on a quote earlier from Dr. Burlog, where it talks about the economy of it has to be met first, and then we can start making some additive decisions on what our purchasing dollar will do. Next slide. Consumers want to know the backstory. But think about it. As we start talking about adding maybe another acronym, so now they've been chasing after the non-GMO, and now maybe we're going to start looking at, well, is it an IGA? We're adding another acronym that consumers are going to be faced with to try to learn when all that consumer wants to do, whether it's a mom or a dad, when they run into the grocery, they want to make a decision on how to best feed their family most economically and with the most assurance that they're doing the very best that they can as a parent. That's all that you really want to do. And that's why I have my conversations. I'm not in D.C., but that's the way I start my conversations. I'm like, look, I'm just feeding my family the same way that you are. We've got to be able to have that deliverable and help consumers become comfortable with what we're providing them in the industry. Consumers want transparency. They want us to be able to tell the stories to them with great confidence where the livestock's raised, processed, and how it means, what it means to them in their purchasing decisions. Slide. Sustainably raised. You know, as we look at another acronym, we in the industry have a dream of what we believe sustainably raised is. Research from Miden has shown consumers believe sustainably raised means no antibiotics, and it was good for the animal. How many of you in here today have a yeah but to that? But what about that I can pass it on to my family? What about that I'm taking care of the environment? What about that I'm doing more with fewer resources? We've got a whole additive as to what sustainability means to us, whereas a consumer's pulling back and telling us it means two things: no antibiotics, and that it's been good for the animal. So think about what those things mean as we try to figure out how to take forward the story of gene editing. 60% of consumers are looking for something that tells them that that animal was raised humanely. Next on the forefront, what do we see coming? We're going to start seeing a lot about worker care. Are you treating your workers the way that they need to be treated? So the dynamics of what a consumer is faced with as they're trying to decide where their dollar is going to go is huge. Next slide. Some of our programs that we have in place where we are helping validate claims that are going on labels. Source and age verification. Most important for export markets to the European Union is non-hormone treated, but we're also starting to see that come into our domestic markets. And largely in domestic markets, we're starting to see a lot of verified natural beef. No growth promotants, no antibiotics, and no animal byproducts in the feed stuff that that animal is eating. So these are more and more additive things that are coming to the marketplace that consumers are starting to ask some more questions just because they're wondering, where does their food come from? Is there a story that I can tell as I'm feeding my family that I have confidence in? Next slide. In 2019, we started a program So I'm laying some groundwork that's going to show you here in the next slide as to economically what difference it's made to producers that have participated in programs like this. We added our CARE certified program, and the CARE certified program has 3 pillars. It adds in the animal welfare and care, it adds in the environment and how well the producer is caring for the environment, and it adds in how well they support their community, and thus being overall sustainable. One piece that I'd like to highlight, and I know that the slide is busy and there's a lot of details in there, but there within animal care, have you, any of you in here heard anything about high-path avian influenza crossing over into the dairy industry recently? Yep, and a lot of restrictions on how cattle are traded and moved, particularly within the dairy industry. We had industry come to us and ask us, can you help us figure out within the beef industry what can be done? What are some solutions that can be done? So we've added a secure food supply where we are helping with cross-industry from the producer, from the ranch level, all the way to the feedlot level on how to make sure that we're maintaining the best secure food supply that's available and handling biosecurity type efforts. Next slide. This is what we saw in care growth from 2022 into 2023. These are the pure numbers that we're seeing where we've got an increase. I think whoa, that one works. All right. You thought you could shut me down. That didn't work. All right, just a real quick recap. We've seen the program grow year over year, and this shows the continued dedication of the American cattlemen and trying to provide the best product forward and being able to show that we in the livestock and cattle industry are producing sustainably. What's unique about the care profile is that it goes across proteins. So not only do we have it in the beef industry, we have one for dairy, we have one for swine, and we have one for poultry. So these are the sheer numbers in care growth within the beef program and how producers are continuing to tell their story of sustainability above and beyond what may come to a consumer's mind first and foremost. Next slide. Okay, I promised you I'd show you some numbers that would matter. Let's take a look at what happens in the marketplace as we're driving value back to producers by participating in branded and marketing programs. We have Source and Age, NHTC, Verified Natural. So these premiums that are coming back into a producer's pocket per hundredweight are additives. So if you're non-hormone treated, you're also Source and Age. If you are Verified Natural, you're Source and Age plus NHTC Verified Natural. But take a look at the bottom numbers here as you go across on Verified Natural, adding additional dollars into your pocket by reaping the benefit of the way that you continue to market your beef. So successful stories for you to be able to tell. And we're proud to be able to be part of you being able to do that. Next slide. The whole question that we started with is how do consumers and what do they know about gene edited? I'd like to preface this by saying the information that we have that we are sharing from Miden is from 2021. They are in process of updating and telling and sharing more information, but initial gut check feel 53%, over half of that consumer group, and I believe there were over 1,200 respondents in this consumer profiling, negative or very negative. Almost equally, half that number, 46% of them, said that they don't know that they would try it. And is that because we just gave them the phrase gene edited, and the first thing that they correspond that to is the fact that they're sitting there going, does that have something to do with that GMO thing? And then as I read some of the information and the data from that, their general gut check of very educated consumers are like, ooh, that sounds gross. That's unnatural. I don't want anything to do with it. So there's already some negative connotations there that we, as the scientists, researchers, and producers, that we must have very fundamentally go forward and try to figure out, where does it have a consumer face, and how would this have a positive impact for consumers? Okay? Next slide, please. Which programs are in existence already that gene edited would be allowed or not allowed? And this is some information that a colleague of mine, Laura Wright, shared with the American Hereford Association when their team got together. But let's take a look at where cloning is prohibited, prohibiting of genetically modified or engineering. So the programs for National Organic, the Non-GMO Project, or the Butterfly People, American Grass-Fed, the Global Animal Partnership, or GAP, which is largely marketed in Whole Foods, Humane Farm Animal Care, Certified Humane, and Animal Welfare Approved, prohibit cloning as well as genetic modification. So it does not allow you to advance the technology. It does not allow us to catch up with what's going on in industry or with our competitors internationally. However, when you step down here to where food comes from, care, non-hormone treated, V&B, and source and age verified, you're able to do the genetic editing. Okay? A lot of the things, a lot of the claims, a lot of those programs, the definition of what is permissible and not permissible, when it comes to breed verification, we rely on you gentlemen to set that. That's not our space to make that determination. You represent what your membership wishes, and that's where we step in and help do that validation and verification. Next slide, please. Let's take a little bit bigger look into what consumers are telling us. When it comes, and again, this is from the 2021 Miden research, they're telling us their initial reaction, 14% of the respondents, only 14% of them responded positively, that it could have some sort of a positive impact on them as a consumer. I think we've got a pretty big mountain to climb. Back to the top of the mountain where we don't know anything, I think we're riding at the peak of it right now. When you ask them what they thought gene edited meant, they go to GMOs and CRISPRs. So we're talking about a very educated consumer, but again, they think initially it sounds very unnatural. What are we doing? What are we doing? Consumers that are interested in trying gene-edited meat keep an open mind about new food and would be interested in hearing the benefits, but consumers currently unwilling to try gene-edited believe that it is unnatural and unsafe. So that's where it becomes very critical. How do we find what is important to consumers so that we can deliver this technology as a solution to what their concerns are? How do we do that? Next slide, please. I think it's an exciting opportunity, and the technologies and the science that you all reported is very, very exciting. So I appreciate that very much. And I believe the rest of our panelists have some additional great information to share with you.
Perfect. Thanks, Kara. We'll have Banks come up and share his perspective from the Pig Improvement Company.
Great, thank you. just want to start off by thanking Dr. Johnson for having me. Thanks for the planning committee for including me, and it's great to be at Oklahoma State. It's my first time here. It's a beautiful campus. My name is Banks Baker. I'm PIC's Global Director of Product Sustainability, and so in my role, I'm primarily responsible for the global introduction and launch of our gene-edited PRRS-resistant pig, which is a really exciting opportunity. I've been with PIC for a little over 2 years now. I joined after 5 years at McDonald's Corporation, where I led protein sustainability for the U.S. business. And so I was in charge of things like animal health and welfare, antibiotic stewardship commitments and policies. And then while I was there, McDonald's became the first global restaurant company to set a science-based target greenhouse gas reduction claim. And so really my job changed overnight, and all of a sudden I was working with producers and ranchers, producers, packers, processors, and across the supply chain to try to figure out how do we meet all of these goals at the exact same time. And the truth is we're asking a lot of producers, we're asking a lot of agriculture, especially in animal agriculture, and we can achieve the things that are being asked of us, but we're going to need to utilize technology to get there. Gene editing is an excellent example of that, and I think it was a great setup with Kara, and you get to see, there's some uncertainty around the technology, but in all of our conversations, everything goes back to the benefits, and so we're going to talk a little bit about what that means here today. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just give you a quick background. PIC is the Pig Improvement Company. We are a global porcine genetics business, so we sell genetics in 40 countries around the world. We have significant market share in a lot of those countries, and what we do is we sell genetic improvement. We make animals more efficient, we make them more profitable for our producers, and we've been doing so for 60 years, and we get better every single year. We have long-term customer partnerships that are delivering shared value. When our customers win, so do we. And now with new tools like gene editing and our PRRS-resistant pig, it allows us to continue on that legacy of innovation and delivering that value in partnership with our customers. So as already mentioned, so some of you may be aware of ABS, American Breeding Services. That is our bovine division within our company. We have a parent company that's called Genus. We're traded on the London Stock Exchange. And so Genus owns both PIC on the porcine side and then ABS that covers beef and dairy. And so that's just a quick level set on who our company is and what we do. Next slide. Great. So we're going to talk a little bit about the PRRS-resistant pig, and I'm not a scientist, and so Dr. Allison gave a great overview last night on her keynote speech on the technology. I'm not going to be talking too much about the technology, and honestly, the consumers and most downstream folks don't really want to hear too much about the technology, and we're going to get into that in a bit. But porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome virus is a devastating disease. It's among the world's most costly. There's some updated numbers that are coming out right now out of Iowa State and some new estimates that are coming out of private business in the pork industry. We're just in the United States, we're talking about $1 billion a year. And so we're talking about an economically devastating disease. And so that's causing animal welfare implications. That's causing producer implications. We now have a solution for that. We have an absolute solution for this devastating problem. Next slide, please. And so again, we're not going to get into too much of the technology, but I did just want to give you an overview. PIC partnered with researchers at the University of Missouri to identify a solution to PRRS. And so using gene editing technology, we can remove the binding site of a target protein, CD163, and I apologize, it looks like this got messed up a little bit. It's essentially just a strand, and we're showing that we're able to remove a specific domain on that protein, and once we do that, the PRRS virus can no longer bind to that CD163 protein, and it makes the pigs completely resistant to disease. And so we're not talking about slightly resilient, we're not talking about not as bad, we're talking about completely resistant. They can no longer contract that disease. It can no longer replicate in their cells in their body. Next slide, please. So what's the difference between our PIC's PRRS gene editing and GMOs? This is something that has different nuances across the value chain. When we talk to regulators, certainly it's important. When we talk to customers, it's slightly important. But it is important for everybody in the room to at least have a level set and understand generally what the differences there are. And so in gene editing, a protein is deleted from an organism's own DNA to modify its genetic code. And so no foreign DNA is inserted. Whereas on GMO, on genetic modified organisms, DNA from another organism is introduced to modify that genetic code. And so for our persistent pig, we're specifically just talking about that gene editing technology. Next slide, please. And so as exciting as the technology is, and I mean, wow, it's really, really cool, right? And we spent a lot of time talking about it today, but by and large, and I can tell you that around the value chain, most people don't really want to talk about the technology. They don't want to know how it works. They don't want to know the specifics of how it was developed. They want to know what it means to them. And this technology means a lot to all of us. It means a lot to all of us no matter where you are in the value chain or in the supply chain spectrum. And so this is essentially our market acceptance strategy and how we're planning on gaining and earning market acceptance for our product is we're going to be accurately, authentically quantifying what that value is and then allowing each segment of that value chain to understand what that is. Gene editing and our PRRS-resistant pig are going to create an enormous amount of shared value across the production chain. Now, being a genetics company, most of the relationships that we have in our traditional business model, we do an excellent job about talking about production efficiencies. That's what we're selling to producers. And oftentimes, whenever we've seen other technologies come into the market, and as they've been introduced, we've been hyper-focused on selling those production efficiencies that occur all the way back at the farm level, all the way back at the producer level. But it's increasingly important for us to be able to express what those production efficiencies mean to every other part of the value chain. And so production efficiency is great for profitability of the farm, but the consumer doesn't necessarily want to hear that. They're interested in food affordability, availability, but they do not necessarily want to hear that a farmer's just being more profitable on a technology that they're unaware of. And so how are we able to connect those production efficiencies in a contextually relevant way that packers and processors, that food service and retail, and consumers can all agree that this is a benefit to them? We need to be able to answer one of the most important questions that all of us ask ourselves in our personal and business lives every day. What's in this for me, and why do I care? And increasingly, and even the conversations here, we've been going to these types of meetings for years, all of a sudden we're talking a lot more about sustainability. We're hearing a lot more pressure about the reduced need for antibiotics. What does that mean? How can we express that production efficiency so that consumers care? Next slide, please. And so we believe that our PRRS-resistant pig brings tremendous shared value to all stakeholders. Of course, it's a disease. It's a devastating disease, and so there's improved animal welfare. The antibiotic usage component is significant, especially at the food service retail level and at the consumer level. I can tell you from coming from one of the world's largest protein supply chains that the pressure is ratcheting up on antibiotics significantly, and we need solutions that responsibly reduce need. Also on productivity and sustainability, I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. You cannot go into any animal agriculture or agriculture discussion without sustainability rising to the forefront. This is going to be the new way that we are judged. And these are the values that are getting asked of us to deliver, that our customers want, that our customers' want. We need to make sure that we're delivering it to them in a tangible, credible, and defensible way. Then also around system robustness. Since COVID, it seems like all of a sudden we hear the term resiliency quite a bit. Right? How do we make sure that supply chains stay active, keep farmers on the land, keep businesses operational? Removing a devastating disease allows us to have a more reliant supply chain for pork production, and then eventually this technology will help in other spaces as well. Next slide, please. But as we all know, the consumer is the one that's in the driver's seat. The consumer is the one that ends up actually getting to make this decision. And as we saw, there's research that you see over and over again. If you introduce this as just a technology, like how do you feel about gene editing in your meat? Something that I don't know about, into something that's very personal that I consume, over and over again, there's some concern, there's unawareness. I don't really know how I feel about it. And if I'm slightly concerned, then I'm probably not going to choose that product. But whenever we couple that technology with the benefits that it provides, that shared value that we just talked about, that provides value to everybody in the value chain, it changes the discussion. And so we've completed some research with Circana. They're a very well-known consumer research group globally. And what we did was we said in the United States, we need to make sure that because the consumer's in the driver's seat, where are they on gene editing technology? How do they feel about it? How do they want us to talk to them about it? What are the things they care about? What are the concerns that they have? And so we did some very interesting research with Circana, and we did some qualitative focus groups. And that was actually just around having conversations. It was a diverse group of pork consumers around the United States. And we asked them those questions, and we actually got feedback, and it was a robust dialogue. We used that robust dialogue to then build out a quantitative survey instrument that we put across over 1,000 different pork consumers in the United States. And you can see here, when we asked respondents to rank the factors that would most likely motivate them or consumers to purchase gene-edited pork, the things that resonated with them most were things like FDA approval. Is this even something that is safe for me, that the government is allowed and approved for use? That was kind of seen as table stakes. That was 27% of respondents ranked that as number one. After that, animal welfare, better for the environment, reduced need for antibiotics. Those were the next important factors. And so you can kind of see, like, these aren't much different than all of the other pressures that we're getting. They're telling us the things that they care about, and we now have a technology that allows us to address those concerns in a very direct and quantifiable way. I think the other interesting thing is if you add up here better for the environment, less energy required, and less greenhouse gas emissions, that comes in at 26%, just below that table stakes FDA requirement. And so the consumer's increasingly caring about the environment, especially as it pertains to the animal proteins that they're raising. We're going to need gene editing to address all of these things at the same time. And so this is just U.S. research. We are replicating this research around the world in other geographies that we're currently seeking regulatory approval in. But we expect in some of our early conversations and indications are that the consumer's in fairly similar categories and feedbacks. Next slide, please. So one of the most important factors, and almost it rises in the conversations, antibiotic comes up significantly. And as I said, I used to work on our corporate antibiotic policies on McDonald's U.S. supply chain, and there's a lot of pressure there. And unfortunately, we're starting to habitualize the supply chain and consumers that no antibiotics ever is good, that zero is the goal, that a reduction percentage, if I'm reducing 10% this year, it's better than last year if I only reduced by 9 or if I went up by 1. But we that have been in agriculture, that have raised animals before, we know that if an animal's sick, just like us, just like our children, just like our pets, if they're sick, they need to be treated, and they need to be treated expeditiously. It's very important. It's an animal welfare issue. And so as we start seeing these corporations that are making these commitments, we need to make sure that we are providing solutions that truly reduce the need for antibiotic use. Not just reducing the use so that we can defer it or get into some type of program or marketing campaign. We need to actually make the animals healthier so that they don't need the antibiotics in the first place. Our PRRS-resistant pig provides an excellent opportunity to do that. This was some research that came out of Iowa State. This was independent of PIC. We did not directly fund this. Dr. Isidore Machado, underneath Dr. Gustavo Silva at Iowa State's veterinary school, they researched the impact of PRRS on the need for antibiotic use. And the outcomes of the study were really striking. I've worked in this space for quite some time. I don't know if I've ever seen numbers that are quite this big. PRRS infections more than double the use of antibiotics. It's a 380% increase in pig antibiotic treatments once herds become infected, and a greater than 200% increase in injectable antibiotic use. Those are staggering numbers. If If we can remove PERS from the supply chain, and now we can with our technology, those are incredible advancements. And these are things that the consumers are telling us they care about, the packers are caring about, the NGOs that are pressuring us are caring about, the stakeholders that invest in our companies that are actually leveraging us as investors with pressure, they say that they care about. We now have a huge opportunity to be able to provide realistic, responsible reductions. I'm going to switch a little bit to some of the climate pressures. This is real, guys. I mean, this is changing the way that all business operates, especially agriculture and especially animal agriculture. As I mentioned earlier, I was at McDonald's when they became the first global restaurant company to set an SBTI. That's a specific brand of greenhouse gas reduction commitment. When I started at PIC, I was using this similar slide a little over 2 years ago. And at that time, more than 1,000 companies in 50 sectors were working with SPI to set targets. As of today, it's greater than 8,200, and that number is going up constantly. This number underneath it is pretty staggering. Companies that have now set SBTI climate-based greenhouse gas reduction goals, they represent over a third of global market capitalization. $38 trillion. And so these are companies across every industry, not just agriculture, not just food, that are setting these ambitious commitments, and they're trying to figure out, like, what does this mean? How do I achieve it? And it's not just corporations. We're seeing an incredible amount of commitments that are being made at countries. And it's a busy slide. I know you can't see, next slide, please. It's a busy slide. I know you can't see all of it there, but that kind of big, long rainbow graph there, these are all countries that have made net zero commitments by 2050. Not just a 30% reduction by 2030. These are net zero by 2050. Next slide, please. And the U.S. protein industry has taken notice, and they've adjusted as well. We've seen really ambitious goals that have also followed out of our protein industry. Pork has a 40% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. Then, of course, beef, NCBA has a carbon neutrality by 2050. And then dairy, a carbon neutrality by 2050. These are big goals. I mean, these are really big goals, and they're coming out. How can we achieve these responsibly while still having operations that are viable for the land, for our people, for the animals, and the planet? So, you've heard a lot of people talk about, hey, gene editing, like we're lowering carbon emissions, right? It's got to be better. We're lowering carbon emissions. But I'm here to tell you that's very important, but we need to stop talking about that generally. We can't just say number like, hey, it's better because it has to be. It's intuitive. There's a lot of pressure on us, and if we go out there and we say something, we had better have metrics to back it up. By how much and by what measure and what validated that claim. Because we are getting challenged. You heard about braised beef. Everything that we say is at one point likely going to be litigated, and so we need to be careful about what we're saying. I think we used to be able to say things generally because they made sense, they were linear. We need to be able to prove them credibly. And so for PIC, we know that this is an improvement, a very important value factor that all of the value chain is telling us, like, we're interested in gene editing, we're interested in GHG reductions. How much is it? Where does it come from? Can we claim it? And so that's an important thing that we're working on. So we're doing life cycle assessments, and you heard Dr. Roundtree talk about this a little bit earlier today, to understand what are the role of PIC genetics as they sit today without gene editing. And I'm excited to tell you that we actually just got our North American results back, and so this is without gene editing, without PERS-resistant pig included in the equation. A PIC full program pig, and so both a sire and a dam, delivers in a 7.5% reduction in GHG emissions compared to the industry average. And that gets better by 1% every single year. We're also doing LCAs to quantify this exact same number in Japan, in China, in Europe, and then we're also completing one on PERS. We just got our first PERS LCA completed. We're submitting it to our ISO review panel. All of our LCAs, because I just talked to you about how important it is to be credible and defensible, are going to be certified by the International Standardization Organization, ISO, who has an LCA protocol. And then every one of our LCAs will also be peer reviewed. When we show up and we're making a claim, we're going to be able to validate it through credible processes, data, and experts. Now, I'm going to talk to you about something that we call genetic carbon. This is a new term. This is something that we are coining. This is something that we're bringing to market. I was at McDonald's. I was trying to find solutions. How do we credibly reduce emissions associated with animal protein? Things like cover crops and no-till and regen grazing, those are all going to be really important. Those models are very, very difficult to validate. Biological processes, environmental variables, those really mess those models up. Pork's a little bit interesting because most of our production's inside. We're not segmented with a lot of different ownership structure, and so our models are much cleaner. Genetics have never been utilized as an investable, scalable greenhouse gas reduction that corporations, governments, or any of these other NGOs that are trying to reduce emissions. It's interesting. We know, and we can now prove through our LCA data, that one of the most important things that we can do to improve the sustainability of protein production is to choose the right animal. To choose an animal that's robust, that's healthy, and that's efficient. That is sustainability, guys. Like, the producer is able to have a production efficiency, and we can express that as the greenhouse gas reduction potential. But that's never been an equation. That's never been an opportunity that a McDonald's, a Costco, a Tyson, a JBS has ever invested in. And so at PIC, we're actually carving out for the first time and allowing that to be a part of the equation. And so we've got our quantification. We can say PIC genetics, even without gene editing, provide a 7.5% reduction, but that doesn't allow anybody to claim it. And so we've got a partnership with the U.S. National Pork Board, where we've actually created an industry-wide framework that outlines all of the things that have to exist in order for a corporation that has a climate goal, that's 83% of Fortune 500 global companies that have one of those right now, to be able to claim the use of elite genetics as a greenhouse gas reduction. Of course, that also lays the groundwork for market acceptance and allows them to understand what that shared value is once our PRRS-resistant pig comes onto the market. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just give you a little bit of an update on our estimated regulatory and commercialization timeline. We did receive a positive determination in Colombia. Colombia, and you see these countries, you'll see approval and determination. In some countries where it's determination, essentially you submit your information, they evaluate it, they say, all right, this is not a genetically modified product, it is just gene edited, therefore we're going to treat it the same as a conventional pig. And so we've already received positive determination in Colombia in 23, and I didn't put my check mark on there, but I'm happy to say that the spring of this year, we've also received positive determination in Brazil. We're finalizing our FDA packet. We're in the final stages of FDA approval, and we're hoping to get FDA approval sometime in 2025. But we also understand that just like the beef market, the pork market's global. And we need to make sure that as we introduce this technology that we're intentional and that we're thoughtful. And so we're also making sure that before we commercialize, that we also have these other very important import-export countries that have also approved. And so Canada, Japan, Mexico, we're also working on submissions there, but our current plans are to commercialize in 2026, waiting for all of those other key markets to also be able to follow up and allow the sale of this product in and out of their country. So as you continue to hear about gene editing technology, as you continue to hear about our PRRS-resistant pig, one thing that I'd really like for you to take home is that a commercialization decision does not happen upon a approval. And so when we get FDA approval, that does not mean that the product is onto the market. That does not mean that we've begun selling or commercializing that product. That only happens when we have that core group of other countries that allow us to export. Also, this is new technology, and it's really never been commercially launched. And I think the only thing that we really have to try to compare it to is around pharmaceutical products. Where a pharmaceutical product can be introduced and it can have wide coverage within 12 months. This is a genetic technology. And so we disseminate that technology the same way we would any other genetic improvement. And so it takes time. It takes time to breed that genetic in. It takes time to breed up those breeding animals' availability in. And so the way we like to talk about this is that it's a dimmer switch and it's not a light switch. A lot of the other questions that I get from producers are around market dynamics. Like, man, if we can remove PRRS tomorrow, that's going to flood the market with too many pigs. But that's not the way that it works. You know, these agricultural markets, they're constantly adjusting to different market signals. And this isn't an all of a sudden flash up and down. There's a dimmer switch that's going to slowly, over the course of 5, 7, 10 years, that will allow the U.S. producer and producers around the world to be able to utilize this technology and eliminate PRRS from the pork production system. But gene editing is not a PRRS-resistant pig. We're not the only one. PIC, we're proud to be in this space. We're proud to be leading. We're proud to be among the first to introduce this commercially viable technology, but we're not the only one. And so I constantly have these conversations where people are like, well, the consumer doesn't want gene editing. Well, they don't really know what gene editing is, and we don't even know what the future of gene editing is going to hold. And so in the past, we could say no to a product, and we've seen that happen with different types of pharmaceuticals or inputs, and you can say no to one specific product, but we don't even know what the future of gene editing is going to hold. We're now just getting started. And so all of us need to be careful about lumping in a whole suite of technologies into one simple application, one single application, like our PRRS-resistant pig. We've seen some pretty incredible advancements on the human health side. Some of you may have seen that the UK last winter, and then a few months later, the FDA have approved for the first time a gene-edited therapy for sickle cell anemia. And so that's actually on the market now. There are human health applications to this technology. There is a Conscious Foods. It's actually owned by Pairwise, where they have a gene-edited mustard green, where they've been able to remove some of the bitterness and increase the palatability of that product. That's already in food service and potentially going to be moving into retail. And then in animal production, I think you heard quite a bit about some of these moving forward. There's gene edits so that we can only have female replacement hens. We've got the slick cow we heard from Tad earlier today. We've got the sea bream and the puffer fish that are in Japan. The list is and will be going on and on. HPIA and bird flu was mentioned earlier today, and we talk a lot about these technologies when we're introducing them. You think if we had an avian influenza edit, that would get fast-tracked through? We'd be as concerned about all of these stop gates? I don't think so. I think that this is the future of what we do, and we need to be careful and concerted about the way that we introduce it. And so as we see all of these technology, all of these gene-edited technologies being applied to all of these different spaces, this is the way of the future. Gene editing isn't coming. It's here right now. It's happening right now. And I truly believe, studying this space, being in this space, bringing this product to market, gene editing is going to become ubiquitous. I believe there's a time, 5, 10, 15 years from now, where we actually laugh at this concept of, like, you remember when we didn't have this technology? This is going to be ubiquitous. When you go into our grocery store now, I thought there was an interesting example from Dr. Allison earlier with the consumer around bioengineered. 60-70% of some of those middle lane retail store, grocery stores already have some type of GMO product in them. We need to make sure that we're able to share those benefits, communicate what that means, and don't overly harp on the technology and the parts that really very few of us understand. So I want to thank you for your time today, and looking forward to some continued discussion. This is my email. I'm always interested in hearing from folks, any feedback that you have or any questions that you might have about our product or some of the things that we're doing. But I appreciate your time greatly.
Perfect. Thanks, Banks. So we have 3 other panelists that are joining us here today, and we're going to just let you guys kind of sit, right, and talk about kind of how your breed associations have approached gene editing. We've heard about the consumer perspective. Obviously, we have one that's, in the porcine world and things like that. But obviously, there's been a breeder perspective around this and a breed association perspective. And so maybe we'll start with you, Tom, but just share with us a little bit around your policy and some of the conversations that you guys have went through.
Try it again. Here we go. Well, Banks did something that some of the earlier speakers didn't do, and he would be like me. I thought our earlier speakers this morning were outstanding for several different reasons. They provided great content, but they also could pronounce Dr. Allison's last name. Did you catch that? And I can say John Beaver, and I can say David Faber, and I can say Tad Sonstegard, but she's going to be Dr. Allison, I think, for me this morning. So, no, it's been a great discussion. I just have a few things to say, and then I'll quickly go over the policy of the Red Angus Association of America as it relates to gene editing. So Tad said that genetics are power, and in the beef industry, I think we're just on the very front edge of really understanding that. If you go around the industry, there's limited, I think, really at all levels almost understanding across. Not to say that some people don't really get it, but I think there is we are just beginning to understand that we can make our industry so much better, so much more efficient, our product more everything to the consumer. And a lot of that will come through genetics. The other thing to think about here as it relates to gene editing is we need combination cattle, don't we? We need cattle that do many, many things well. Who in this room, and I'll bet it's a lot of you, have done an EPD lookup on a bull you're considering to use AI, or maybe it's a bull you're looking to buy, and there's all these traits, right, across the screen. And you're studying those traits very closely because you need combination cattle in your operation. And sometimes we've all owned bulls in the past. We've owned animals that we said, man, this animal does so many things well, but there's just this one little chink, right? That's potentially where gene editing can fit right in. So we need combination cattle, and gene editing really can help us get there and utilize, think about the pole gene in Holsteins that we've talked about. The other thing we need is low friction. If we expect the industry to adopt and really pick up better genetics, they have to be able to do it in a low friction way, don't they? Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Otherwise, the adoption rate will be very slow. And the great thing about gene editing is it's heritable to the next generation, right? So we need to keep the pressure on the regulatory side. As I've listened to the conversation this morning, it's hard not to get excited, but at the same time, I think we're all tempered. We're just sitting here and we're saying we're suppressed. The limiting stave in the barrel is the regulatory side, and so we got to keep a lot of pressure on that. So now quickly to the Red Angus Association policy, and this is something that we have just adopted in the last about 18 months. Maybe it's been 2 years now. We are an open herd book at Red Angus, so we have, like some other breed associations, you can breed animals up. And we also have an open mind on crossbreeding for sure, and that's been a long tenet of the Red Angus Association. So maybe that's why when gene editing came around and we had some requests to include those animals specifically into our registry, we decided to do it. We contemplated for some time. We like the fact that the edits that we've seen so far are natural edits, and Tad did a great job of describing that. And so that makes it pretty easy because you can put these genes into a population just by normal breeding practices. So far, the Red Angus Association has approved 2 gene edits, and that would be the slick gene and also black to red, both of which have been talked about. Those are both natural edits, and I didn't hear Tad say it yet, but I've heard him say before, that's DNA we've all been eating for a long, long time. And that's true. So there's nothing new about it. We decided that our policy at the Red Angus Association would be open to gene edits, but we would also evaluate them one at a time and approve them one at a time. And so that's where we are. As I mentioned, we have, and I think that's similar to maybe the rest of this group, but in the industry in general. But we will evaluate those as they come. We do have a couple that are open. One last comment on that, just because this has come up too, is we do track those animals. And we don't have very many in the system yet, but we do have some. And they are labeled, so they are identified as a genetic GAF, without the I, but GAF, a founding animal, and then a progeny of those animals. So we will be able to track those in the system as they go forward. And that's pretty simple, and it's still an evolutionary process, but that's where we are at the Red Angus Association, Kelly.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom. And I believe, Macaulay, you have a couple of slides that maybe you wanted to flash up, so if Bray could help us with that. But we'll go ahead and listen to a little bit of what the policy is at the American Angus Association.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly, and just applaud everyone for sticking in on this topic. It's some heavy lifting, right? It's a complicated topic, and I compliment everybody on being here to educate yourself, learn more, be engaged in that discussion. I think that is exactly how this industry has moved forward in the past on these kind of things, and will continue to move forward. If I could take that first slide, please. I just put this up here just to demonstrate this has been kind of an ongoing and evolving topic at the American Angus Association. You can't probably read all of those things, but some of you might be familiar with our Breeder's Reference Guide. As we make rules and policies, we put when those rules and policies were first adopted and then any time they were revised after that. What you'll see in our gene editing policy, they were first adopted in September of 21 and have been revised 4 times since then. And not so much the direction or the decision around yes or no on gene editing. Simply, it's been, I think, a reflection. We've tried to learn more, right? And I think we've had lots of questions, has been well highlighted about the regulatory process, how these things come to market. And so I only use this to point out this has been an ongoing and evolving discussion at the American Angus Association. Next slide, please. I just probably put some things, just a bit of a laundry list of considerations of maybe some of the current discussions or past discussions that we've had within our membership, that our board has dealt with and engaged with our membership on. As Tom mentioned, we have different than at Red Angus. We actually have a closed herd book, so that does tend to enter in a little different wrinkle for the American Angus Association as we think about these things, because we have to go back to our charter, our association bylaws and such, as it relates to some of the specific language in there about breed purity and how the breed is defined. But then enters into some discussion around, well, is insertion the same as deletion? And so again, it's not as simple, but it's that's part of the consideration and part of the discussion that has taken place. Obviously, as been again highlighted, the regulatory process and the labeling of these products has been a big discussion. And I want to also be clear, it's not obviously the American Angus Association's decision of whether these technologies come to market, right? It's simply the decision of whether a gene-edited animal is entered into the herd book of the American Angus Association. But obviously these questions that then come about around consumer acceptance of these products, how does it impact our branded program in certified Angus beef? All of these things obviously are wrapped into this discussion that we've had relative to gene editing. Consumer acceptance of the technology, and all others. And I think one of the interesting things that I've had discussions with Cattlemen and our members about this topic, I find it kind of interesting. We tend to be really comfortable with talking about sex semen and in vitro fertilization and genomic technology, genomically enhanced EPDs. But when we get to gene editing, there's some folks that go, well, that's a drastically different technology. I would tell you to our consumer and to the folks that sell our product every day, the distance between some of our technologies that we're comfortable with and maybe some that we get less comfortable with, that distance isn't nearly as far as maybe what it is for us as cattlemen. And I only throw that out. I've had quite a bit of experience with messaging and talking to and honestly defending a lot of our technologies to consumers when you're talking to food service groups, chef groups, retailer groups. I think Banks, you hit the nail on the head. We tend to educate around these things historically around sit down, be quiet, and let me tell you all about the science. And I think again, approaching it the way you are. What is the benefit? What is the benefit to the consumer? What's the benefit to our end users that are out there selling and representing our product? I think there's plenty of examples when we've not done this well. We've lost some good technologies. I think the LFTB, pink slime, right, is a perfect example of a perfectly safe technology that we didn't control the messaging on. We didn't control the narrative on. It got out in front of us, and we lost, in essence, a good technology. It's been, gradually coming back to the market. Posilac, RBST, right? A good example around a technology that the narrative got in front of the industry. Our retailers didn't say, here, let us help you producers defend this technology. It was more of a response, get it out of my supply chain. And I think we can learn a lot. I just don't think we want to be naive to how these technologies need to be best moved into the system. International trade implications. Breeder and member education. I think for a breed association, this is always one of the things we have to work on and get the privilege of working on. These are technical. These are very, very technical topics. And I think, it was probably a good example for us of when we had spent a couple years of doing webinars and podcasts and articles and speakers, and have Tad and Allison and others be, with our board, and yet sometimes these things, when we then had a decision around a gene edit put in front of our board, we had a membership coming to us, some saying, I've never heard anything about this, right? And so member education for us, breeder education, is a key part and a key consideration. I think a discussion we have as an association, what is our role truly in dictating what technologies a breeder should or shouldn't use, right? I think that's been a very interesting and important conversation. We've had a fair amount of discussion around breeder or member access to genetics. Are there going to be patents involved? Are there going to be licensing involved? Probably some things that make some of our members, maybe many of our members, uncomfortable as it relates to access to genetics. And then I think there's maybe just some philosophical, right? Some philosophical opinions out there that gene editing is somehow, gone too far, right? That we've gone too far. So not suggesting that that any of these are things we can't overcome, but rather just trying to present maybe the full context of the dialogue and the discussions and the considerations that have gone about from our vantage point. Next slide, please. So this is kind of where we're at, very similar to Tom, and I would say this is an area where we've tried as breed associations to kind of work together, right, and kind of learn from one another, because I do think having consistency around how we treat these, how we talk about these, how we name these, I think that's really important. And so we have an application and an approval process. I mean, that was really where we started when we started considering yes or no on a gene edit. The reality is we weren't really set up in our policies and rules to even have the discussion. And so that's really what a lot of our work has been up to this point. The board has chosen a path that is to look at these on a case-by-case basis. The criteria for approval I put is betterment of the Angus breed. That's what's in our rule, and that's obviously very subjective, very ambiguous, but that's the best we've done to get it kind of nailed down right now in terms of what the criteria for approval would be. We have had one edit presented, applied, and that was Slick. At this point, the board chose to table that edit and that application for the time being, simply to learn more. We had, again, being honest, we had a fair amount of member concern voiced. We had some letter writing campaigns going on, and so the board thought it was best at this point to push pause and to simply learn more, allow our members to learn more, and candidly get some of these questions around the approval, the whole FDA, the labeling, get some of those questions maybe aired out and a little more clarity defined around some of those things. We have some language in our policy around, again, I put in quote, unintended consequences, but more around a safeguard, if you will, a safety net. Should something be found out at a later time, the ability to reverse course on that particular edit. I skipped over, similar to Tom, and I think all of us, of an identification and a tracking system for both founder animals and descendant animals. And also the understanding or the belief that down the road there will probably be animals with multiple edits, right? And so how descendants of founders of multiple edits, and so we're trying to put a system in place of how we would keep track of all of that. And then also we've got, occasionally we'll bring animals in from other societies, other Angus societies around the world, and so we have some import considerations as it relates to our registry. So, just next slide. This is our website. Our breeder's reference guide is out there for anybody that ever want to care to dig down deeper into our rules and policies. They're out there on the World Wide Web.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. And I believe Jack has some slides as well, so if we could get them up for him, but we'll allow Jack to kind of explain from the Hereford perspective.
All right, thank you very much, and I won't take much of your time because, as Mark said, most of us have had multiple conversations on how we're handling this within our different breed associations, and just like Angus, the American Hereford Association has been closed book since 1881, where we track pedigree, and so that's kind of an interesting nuance in this area of technology. The other thing that I tell you, that everyone that spoke here, I have either had personal conversations, or our staff has, or they presented to our board of directors, from this group to the group earlier, and frankly, the rules that we have in place have been put together with a lot of help from this group, including Tad and John. And so we wanted to kind of, just like Mark said, get ahead of this a little bit. We had Tad actually present, it's probably been 7 or 8 years ago, to our board to talk about the technology and where it was headed. I think at the time the consideration was we do allow registry from other breed societies around the world, and as you've seen over the course of the last little bit, other countries are maybe a little more open to this technology, and so as we got presented with those genetics from other countries, we wanted to be able to handle those properly within our breed registry. We, just like Tom and Mark, we do have a process in place to label these animals as they enter our system. Different from Angus, we are not actually labeling the descendants. So if you wanted to know something more about the descendants of an animal with a founder in it, you'd have to just kind of search by the founder. And again, we talked about that this spring. I presented to the board, and these rules are always evolving, and we may go forward with a process like that where we actually identify the descendants of these founder animals as well. I think, again, you can find these rules. I won't bore you to death with them in Section 9 of our rules and regulations. They're part of our handbook, and you can find that on the HA website if you're interested. And again, I want to thank John and Tad. They've been very helpful for us putting these together. The one rule that I would like to go, if you go to my last slide, I think, Bray, and it's rule number 5, and we absolutely at the association do not want to get into any kind of issue concerning the rights and materials of animals or intellectual property. And it's no different than what we would say with a genetic line. You see producers put in sale catalogs that they reserve all the rights of all the genetic material to the animals sold. We don't want to have to get into tracking any of that from an association standpoint, and so that's part of our rules right now, and we're very adamant about that. I'll finish with this because I think it's really important. This group, this last day and a half has been remarkable for me, and I grew up in this business. I love it. Mark and I were just kind of chuckling up here a little bit as they talked about, Banks talked about 2050 and the goals of some of these companies by 2050. And frankly, I will not be around, right, by the year 2050. I'll be long gone. But the thing and the key about this, in my opinion, I have a son that has a passion for this business as well. I don't have any grandkids yet, but I think I will at some point in time. And I want this business to be available for them. It's been a great asset to my life, my family, for many, many generations. And so this is very important on how we handle this and how we handle it moving forward. I also do believe that in the near future, we'll all be looking back and saying, why did we even worry about these things, right? Because it's going to be commonplace, and I believe it will move us forward in terms of efficiency, animal welfare, the value of feeding a growing population. I think it's imperative. So that's all I've got to say. Again, thanks to Mark and everyone involved here. It's been a great day and a half.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. So as we go throughout this panel, as you have questions, please raise your hand. I think they'll bring a mic around to you so you can ask those questions to the panel. I don't see any right now, so maybe we'll just kind of get started with some questions that we had kind of prepared internally. So let's start back at the beginning. We talked a lot about consumer acceptance, right? We heard banks kind of say, like, lead with the why, don't lead with the how, because I think that really probably, we know that doesn't work very favorably, right, with consumers. Maybe, Allison, from your perspective, you live in a much different, much more populous environment than most of us that are sitting up here. And I'm kind of curious of how do we better present this information as we're trying to make it into the mainstream marketplace? And it might very reasonably have a PRRS-resistant pig year in the future for an animal protein source.
Again, I'll go back to the education piece. And last night at dinner, Dr. Allison showed a great clip from a Nova video. I am married to a gentleman who likes to watch PBS, and so I had actually seen that before. And I think stuff like that is great, right? PBS watchers are maybe a subset of, of the American population that's watching programs on there for the diversity of things that they show. And maybe they weren't expecting to see that, and maybe they learned something from that. And I thought that was great. I can't hearken enough to the fact that just educating people, there's a lot of assumptions that are made about a lot of technologies. There's assumptions made about everything out there these days. But one person says one thing, and then the internet runs with it, right? So again, as we look at this technology, I think just making sure that the education piece is out there. There's a lot of people out there saying, let's follow the science. Well, I say back to them, let's follow the science.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe, Kara, I'll tap into your expertise, right? You're all about validating claims and those sorts of things. And I think a lot of the claims around food, right, have been, this is non-GMO, this is gluten-free, all the things that something is not, right? And I think it'd be really easy for someone to say, well, I can put a claim on my animals that these aren't gene edited, right? And kind of try to subset that population away. But is there a way that we could actually reasonably say, okay, we have, this slick gene in cattle, and how does that fit inside of a claim that's a positive rather than trying to take something away or segregate a source?
The biggest part to that is who's the consumer? What's the consumable from the claim that you want to make? So I kind of tongue-in-cheek told you about the purple cow with pink polka dots. It becomes very important as to what that message is, and I think that banks had some of that messaging in what you delivered already as far as taking to the marketplace, taking to that consumer. This slick animal allows and affords us to have these things in place. And by having those things in place, where we step in as the verifier is that we help by, you have predicated these are going to be the requirements in order to be recognized as a slick animal, and so then we pick up the pieces and figure out how to help validate that as it goes to the market.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we heard a lot of that validation from banks. Banks, is there anything else to add from a consumer perception? Obviously, you guys are the furthest, of what I know, right? Some of the furthest along, at least in the U.S. animal protein space.
Yeah, I think the labeling space is really interesting. Right now, in all of the markets that we're currently pursuing regulatory approval or determination, there's not going to be a requirement to differentiate the label. There are some that want to label this with a skull and crossbones because they see PRRS as a competitive advantage within their system, or they don't necessarily want that technology to be delivering the benefit wholly across the system. And something that we're working on in our programs is actually providing a positive label. I didn't have enough time, and so I didn't talk about it, but part of the research that we did with Circana was they said, well, I want transparency. the consumer said, like, I definitely want to have transparency. And we said, okay, here's 6 labels that we think provide transparency. Which are the ones that you like? And the ones that were linked to the technology that said raised with CRISPR, raised with biotechnology, gene edited, they performed extremely poorly. The ones that performed the best, and is no surprise from what I just presented to you earlier, is the one that performed the best was better for the animals and better for the planet. And so, you know, I don't anticipate, like if I look into the glass, I don't think that there's going to actually be a differentiated label. I truly believe that at some point, gene edited, including our persistent pig, will end up just being a commodity product. I mean, the FDA submissions that we're making, what we're submitting to the FDA is that the animals are performing the same except for being disease resistant, that the meat composition and quality is identical. And so, like, there is not a change. And so eventually I think it will just become commodity. But for those that would like to differentiate, we actually are working with, and we actually just got something signed with IMI, where we're going to be actually trying to create an off-the-shelf label that allows us to talk about the positive benefits and maybe even be a value driver as opposed to a liability. And I think we need to kind of continue to remember, like, most people are going to the store, and even if they're outraged, you know, the dollar is the ever equalizer, you know, and so availability and quality tied to price is most likely going to end up being where most consumers are making decisions based on.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, do you have something to add?
Now, I'm not a consumer level marketer, but it seems like in this discussion, and Banks hit on it, but we may need to change our terminology and how we discuss and how we identify what we're doing and give it a friendlier name. That may be a pretty important thing to this going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you kind of going back to Dr. Beaver's point earlier, right? When you sit in a place where you can get food that's pretty high quality and it is affordable, it's really easy to be able to nitpick apart, right? All the words, the terminologies, and be able to have the choice when you go to the supermarket. So obviously we have 2 breed associations that represent some branded beef programs here on the panel with certified Angus beef and certified Hereford beef. I don't know if Mark or Jack, you have any perspectives as to, you know, what are some of the conversations around your branded products, right, that's been happening in your boardrooms, or what's the concern?
Yeah, so I think that is a great question, and it was kind of where we landed a little bit because we did have an edit presented to us as well, which was not approved yet by our board, and that did bring up part of the question. So does it limit our availability to market our product? How is the consumer going to, and I had a great conversation with Kara last summer about this, and I think it was a good move because at the time, I think there are some very unanswered questions about that moving forward. So it is a concern. I think it's interesting. I've had conversations with packers and those that will be actually buying our products. So I'm not sure there's a clear answer there yet, but I like Banks's approach that let's put it into a positive spin, label it if we have to in a way that is consumer friendly, and get the product in front of people.
Yeah, not much to add. I probably shared some of my views on the consumer side of things a little earlier. I do think it is important. I think it probably in both our cases, sometimes we also need to separate what we allow in the breed registry and the herd book. Doesn't necessarily, I mean, you talk about our supply chains fueling our branded programs. We could make a decision of saying, no, we're not going to register a gene-edited animal, and yet when they get commercially available and they're in the supply chain, they're going to be entering into our branded beef programs. And we're going to be finding ourselves talking about them like all other technologies. I think we find ourselves every day in our branded program. We're talking about building and establishing and growing trust with our partners that are selling the product and ultimately the consumer. And it's not just gene editing. They want to know. I mean, we've been talking about GMO for a long time on the feed side, right? I mean, we get questions about GMO feeds. We've been talking about and defending those technologies with our partners and for our consumers for a very, very long time. So again, I think it's going to be more of the same as it relates to continuing to make sure we've got the trust and the credibility with the consumer.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, Banks, you come from a different world, right? You kind of have a system, right, that is a little bit more integrated than what we hear in the beef industry. Beef industry, we tend to be a bit decentralized, and I think you've really kind of laid out the groundwork that you guys have been able to do within PIC. Where do you see just kind of the decentralized nature of the beef industry? How does that create hurdles, right, for this technology, maybe for us to kind of really get it built into our systems?
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I spend so much time thinking about the pork value chain that I haven't focused on the beef world as much. But I do have a strong beef background. I used to work a lot in the beef space. I think that the hardest part with making change is just the segmentation of the industry in general. There's so many different parts of the industry that have to go into the final product, where in pork, our models are clean because production's inside, and so we can guarantee that it's that. It's a shorter lifespan. We don't have backgrounding operations. We don't have finishing operations. And so it's a much different system. And so I think, when you think about having to track that product, or if you even talk about trying to add value to it, it just becomes more complex than where we're at. I also think, though, that because that's such a high value animal, and because that product is so desired in the marketplace, and especially with the market conditions today, that the opportunity is even greater, just because of where beef sits on kind of the value comparison of proteins.
Perfect. Yeah, no, I think that's a great perspective, and it's always good to learn from people that are on the other side. And so maybe for our breed association representatives, talk a little bit about, Mark, you mentioned some letter writing campaigns, and I'm sure that we've all had long conversations in boardrooms around gene editing policies. Tell us a little bit, and I know we've touched on it some, but tell us a little bit about what is the fear of this technology, right? What is the biggest hurdle that you guys have had? Obviously you all run large membership organizations, and there's lots of opinions and personalities and goals and objectives, and what have been the biggest hurdles for you guys?
So I'll start. I think it can be summed up in our case in one word, and that's emotion, right? These are very emotional ideas, thoughts. There's a lot of morality associated with it. I had this conversation with Allison here a few weeks ago, and I don't think there's any question about the technology. It's been proven that it can work. The science works. I think it's all around emotion, frankly.
Yeah, I would concur. I think especially when we don't understand something, when something's new and something's complicated, and it could be a failure of our educational system as a whole, that we don't understand some of these more complex things, and so maybe first reaction is fear. First reaction is to get a little defensive. But I think again, once you work through some of that. I do think we've had a fair amount of discussion, Kelly, as you would know, still about some of this access issues, intellectual property. I think our independent breeders want to stay independent, and I think that's one of the true, in my opinion, one of the true value propositions that a breed association brings today is the ability for independent breeders to have access to data and have access to technology. And so trying to think through how these things play out in this new space has consumed some conversations too.
Just quickly, I'll add, we haven't really had the pushback, but I think it could still be ahead of us at Red Angus because we don't have animals out there. I mean, once the animals can be marketed commercially, that conversation probably comes right back around. I think it will be, I mean, we all have to, we've been talking about education going the consumer direction. It's education going back the other direction too for us. And breed associations probably have a pretty important role, both with their members, but also with their commercial bull customers too. And to me, it probably is one thing, I guess, where my mind goes on that is we've got to start with the real simple traits. And if we can make a horned animal polled, in the case of some really good Hereford genetics, let's say, that's pretty hard to argue with. It's a natural trait. I mean, and maybe the conversation starts there. People understand the dairy industry well enough. We can use some analogies there. and so forth, and go from there. But I think there is still, for all of us, there's a lot of educational work ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Tom. I think we actually have a question out here from the audience.
Yeah, this is actually a question for Cara, and I hope it's not too difficult of a question. But I was interested that you process verify the absence of clones for certain of your segments. And I heard Dr. Faber say this morning they made 100,000 clones, I think, if I wasn't mistaken, at his company. And they're not distinguishable in terms of anything. There's no unique transgene to test for. How do you verify that none of those supply chains involve clones, given the extensive use of it in the breeding sector?
So the programs that require those, Dr. Allison, are ones that so it would have been like the Global Animal Partnership or the GAP, the one for Whole Foods, the one for Certified Humane or American Humane. Those programs require that those animals that go into the marketplace, they do pedigree verifications. So they'll look at that piece, and they also, in the verification efforts that I have done when I've done those audits, I'll just simply ask, are these genetics from any cloned parents? And so that is part of the cross my heart, hope to die, you're looking an auditor in the eye kind of thing.
Well, perfect. Thank you for that answer. And maybe as we kind of continue on here, maybe another one for Allison. From your perspective, right, we talked a lot about today around other countries that are accepting this technology, right? And they're being very accepting. And how does that pressure maybe our government, or how does that change the conversation here? Because obviously it was a really important point that, you know, we heard the first panel bring up, we heard it again from Banks, Cara talked about it a little bit. So from your perspective, what actually does that do, and is there any benefit?
I don't know how other countries necessarily feel, or whether we care. I think our producers who are trying to expand exports certainly care. The trade space, again, is one that we keep a close eye on. Obviously, we want to increase our exports. Our producers want to be able to increase those numbers as well. I think we have those conversations. I think, again, Dr. Allison did a great job of kind of showing that we're behind. And that's frustrating. And I think that's frustrating across the board. Our office gets very frustrated by that as well. We want to, again, we know that we're producing the best beef in the world, but if we can continue to do it even better with new technologies, then, we want to be part of that equation.
Perfect.
I'll say something.
Yeah, Tom has something to add.
It's a huge concern. I mean, it's a huge concern because you look at agriculture as an industry, and the livestock business specifically, we have become the best in the world because why? Because we did adopt technology, and we built it into our learning system, and it happened right here on this campus, right, and a lot of other places. And so we are risking giving up and letting the world edge ahead of us. That's a disadvantage to our producers. It's a disadvantage to our consumers, and also from an export standpoint. So I think it's a very big concern.
Yeah, and I think when you think about tracking, right, we're importing beef from other countries, right? If Brazil is very accepting of this technology, how are we going to track whether gene-edited product is coming into the United States? And so I think that's an interesting question to that point as well. Anybody else have anything to add on that standpoint? Perfect. Do we have any more questions from the audience? I'm not seeing any hands waving around. So once again,
I got one question.
Okay, perfect. Jack's got a question.
Yeah. So Mark, give your mic to Tad. Okay. So we've hinged around this. Mark brought it up. I brought it up just a little bit. So Excelogen is a privately owned company that has invested millions of dollars into this technology. What is the outcome for Excelogen? How does that interact with registrations, breed associations, breeders that are using your technology? And if you move down the road and Excelogen decides to sell to another company, how will that affect us? So what is your value proposition, and how does this interact with what we're doing at breed associations?
Are you asking how we share revenue? I mean, I'm not quite sure. We've invested a lot in the technology, and the revenue generating part for us is royalty on genetic product sales and the development costs. So
that's perfect. That's what
okay.
that was what I was asking.
All right.
Yeah.
Great. Well, good deal. Well, if we don't have any more questions, let's thank these panelists here. Thank you guys for your time. I think that was a really great event, and we'll go ahead and we'll turn it back over to Dr. Johnson.